Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to start the second panel in our day-long program, 1968, the last Jewish exodus from Poland, ? This panel is dedicated to personal No, I'm just the opening comments. It's okay.
No. Speak to the mic.
This panel is dedicated to personal recollections of 1968. We are honored and delighted to have here two extremely distinguished academics. One who has had a long and illustrious career with Tel Aviv University, Professor Marek Karliner, who was educated in his higher education in physics at Tel Aviv University, and since then has been a visiting professor at Stanford, at the Weizmann Institute, at Cambridge, and is now the head of the Sackler Program for Advanced Studies, and continues his work in all kinds of fields of physics that I myself would not even pretend to understand. Quarks and gluons, heavy quarks and spectroscopy. I have my homework cut out for me. Marek will begin our discussions with a presentation of his personal and generational experiences and recollections of 1968. Immediately after Marek's comments, we will hear from Stanislav Staszek-Krajewski, who is also professor of philosophy and mathematics at the University of Warsaw, and as some of you may know, is one of the leaders of Warsaw and of Poland's Jewish community for the past 2 to 3 decades. Staszek was involved with Solidarity, has been involved with the Jewish community since its reconception after the fall of communism. He's also been involved with the Warsaw Museum of Jewish History. I know Dariusz Stola was here an hour ago. Dariusz will be back soon. And Staszek was involved as an advisor to the post-World War II section of the museum. He will give us his perspective, both personal, generational, and perhaps social or political, about 1968 in both history and memory. And without any further ado, it is my pleasure to open the floor to Professor Karliner. Marek, bevakasha.
Okay, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. And I will speak with my perspective, from my perspective as almost 14 years old. I was in elementary school in the 8th grade. At that time, Poland elementary education included, can you hear me okay?
Mic.
Okay. So, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so at that time, elementary school in Poland consisted of 8 grades, and I was in the middle of 8th grade when we left, and never finished the 8th grade, and therefore I am very proud, and I told our rector so, that I am the only professor on our campus who has a written proof of incomplete elementary education. Never finished elementary school, because when I came to Israel, it was already too late to join the school. I didn't know the language, so I started straight from middle school. And the main thing I remember from that time, it really began in '67. My parents told me, as soon as I could understand what I'm being told, that we are Jewish. Both my parents were Jewish, and in their youth they were quite active. Well, my mother was a member of HaShomer HaTzair. She got expelled from her high school for this, because at that time there was a Red Scare in Poland. HaShomer HaTzair was considered a quasi-communist organization. My father was a communist in pre-war Poland, and they were both very conscious of their Jewish heritage, so this was not an issue. But on the other hand, there were big fights between, you might know, there were big fights in pre-World War II Poland between communists and Zionists in my own father's family. One brother went to Palestine, became a member of a kibbutz, and settled here. And my father was a communist. And it was a very deep divide because these people, the communists, believed that the solution to the Jewish problem in Poland, which was a very acute problem, well before the Nazis came, there was a huge problem. The communists believed, honestly, the Jewish communists believed that once the communism takes over, all their problems will be solved. And they had to wait about 30-something years to learn that this expectation was completely naive and completely decoupled from reality. But when I was growing up, we were very much shielded by our parents, who survived the war by being in the Soviet Union at first, and then my father became a soldier in the army that was formed in the Soviet Union, went all the way to Germany. But we were very much shielded, I knew later on, from the realities of, for example, we are told very little about anti-Semitism, and we did not realize it at the time, but we are living in a bubble because my parents' friends were people of similar background. We had a very comfortable apartment in Warsaw, and for a 10, 12 years old kid, life was very nice. And there were no major problems until the Six-Day War, when everything erupted at once. And then I started to realize quite quickly that things are not as simple as I was led to believe. And very quickly in the school, in the press, I started to realize that we are not like everybody else. And this was a major shock. But still, after Six-Day War, in the first months after Six-Day War, it seemed like it's a political issue between the communist bloc and Israel. The anti-Jewish activity of the government and of the Communist Party was not as conspicuous. It took some time to really erupt, and as was mentioned here, it erupted with full force in March of 1968. And we know now from various studies that this was really a byproduct of a generational struggle within the ruling Communist Party. And anti-Semitism, pretending to be anti-Zionism, was just used as a weapon in this struggle. And that in itself was not such a big surprise because there was a long history in Poland of anti-Semitism being used as a weapon in various kinds of internal struggles. The big surprise, I think, not for me because I didn't know any better, but the big surprise, for example, for my father, who was, of course, highly politically conscious, the big surprise was that the Communist Party, to which he devoted the better years of his life, having spent 4.5 years in jail for communist activity in pre-war Poland. The big shock was that these people whom he considered his comrades at arms, people with whom he spent time in jail, even Mr. Gomułka, who at one point was hiding in my grandfather's house for one night because he was pursued by the police, that these people will now fall as low as to use anti-Semitism as a weapon. This was one big shock. The other big shock was how popular it is. It was at that time. This, I think, for me personally, it was something completely unexpected. I knew that there is such a thing as anti-Semitism, but I never realized how virulent and how strong it was in the society. And all of a sudden, when it erupted on several levels simultaneously in the press, even in my school from some teachers, from some classmates, not all, by all, I mean, some classmates of mine behave in a really wonderful way and expressing their revulsion at what was being done by the authorities, but nevertheless, one could not avoid realizing that a significant part of the society is supporting the party. You know, we heard from Professor Stola about hate campaigns. Hate campaigns were nothing new in this communist regime. They reappeared every few years, only the target changed. The thing which was surprising was that in the past hate campaigns, everybody went through the motions because there was really no choice. You were told to come to such and such meeting and to participate in a meeting where West Germany was condemned, or the Polish bishops were condemned for writing a letter of reconciliation to the German bishops in 1966. But people went through the motion and they couldn't care less, and that was the end of it. This was the first time, and I think this was also a big surprise for the ruling party, that their political program was genuinely popular. They did not expect this. If you haven't seen this, I recommend that you watch the famous speech by Władysław Gomułka, where he is genuinely astonished by the huge applause that he gets for mentioning the fifth column and mentioning that, you know, a certain group of citizens of Poland are really not good citizens. Their allegiance is not to Poland and they should leave the country. We will let them leave the country as soon as possible. And suddenly there is this huge eruption. What? Yeah. Today, people shout from the audience, right? And of course, we hear today voices, including people in the highest places in the Polish government of today, who say, well, this wasn't really Poland. This was done by people who were really imposed on Poland by the Soviets. I beg to disagree. This was a genuine grassroots reaction. It is true that the communists did not have popular support in Poland, and indeed the regime collapsed almost immediately after the Soviets basically said, we are not going to use force to keep you in power. However, in this one unique instance, something that the communist government did was genuinely popular. There were millions of members of the Communist Party, and one cannot pretend that this did not happen. It happened to me, it happened to people I know. There were ugly reactions on the street, in the public communications, the trams or the buses. One can ask what is the reason for this, but this is too long a story to discuss now. This was just, I'm just telling you what my impressions were through the eyes of a 13 or almost 14-year-old. It was difficult, it was extremely unpleasant, it was not violent. You know, as somebody mentioned here, there were no physical pogroms. The police were beating up the students, but they were not beating in particular the Jewish students, they were just beating all students. But the atmosphere became unbearable, and my parents, in particular my father, my mother was not in a position, she was very sick. So the person making the decisions in the family really was my father, and he was at that time 68, he was 61, 2 years younger than I am today. At that time, he was very old in my eyes, but when I look at it now, I realize that he was in an extremely difficult position, because a decision to emigrate meant starting everything from scratch, and and not knowing whether he will find a work. And the main reason why he decided to emigrate was that at that time, the atmosphere was getting so dense that he was worried that Poland will go the way of Soviet Union. In Soviet Union, Jews were blocked from attending the best universities. For example, the Harvard of Soviet Union, the MGU, Moscow State University, was essentially Judenrein, especially in mathematics, for instance. And my father was worried that this would happen in Poland. We know, in retrospective, that Gomułka realized at some point that this whole thing is aimed against him personally, and he stopped the process. He called the guy responsible on behalf of the Communist Party on supervising the press, and he told him that if tomorrow there is an article in one of the papers attacking Zionism, you will be out of a job by the evening. And it stopped. But this was something that was impossible to predict. In fact, the problems of Poland went completely other way. Gomułka lost power because of what happened in Poland in 1970, the killing of demonstrators, which had nothing to do with Jews, Gdansk, and so on. But the fear that something like the Soviet system of numerus clausus or numerus nullus can be repeated, that was the driving factor. My sister was 9 years older. She was almost finishing her master's degree, also in physics. It seems to be a family disease. And another aspect of it was that she did not submit her thesis, which was written already. And the reason she did not submit her thesis is to avoid having to pay a huge amount of money, like the Soviet-style, what is called in Hebrew, kofer teuda, which means basically you are forced to repay the state for the free education that the state kindly provided you with. So this would have been like my father's a year's or 2 years' salary, so it was decided she would not submit her master's thesis, and we left, and in fact she went to Stanford to do a PhD, and my parents and I came to Israel. And again, it was another shock. The first shock was to realize that I and our family does not seem to belong where we grew up. Something completely unexpected. I think the shock was much more difficult for my sister than for me, because I was relatively, the younger you are, the easier it is to absorb a major change. But she was 22 in 68, and by the time you are 22, your self-identity is more or less fixed. And if your self-identity is that you are a young Jewish woman in Poland, and you see your future there, and suddenly you are told, look, you should really leave. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody used physical coercion, but the atmosphere and the prospects for the future were such that people decided it's better to leave. And we left. She went to Stanford. We came here, and there was another huge shock, because a 14-year-old Jewish kid from Poland is a very different thing from a 14-year-old Israeli kid who grew up here. It's a huge culture shock, which took a while to readjust. I'm sure you all know what I mean, all of you who came here at some relatively young age. It was difficult, but it passed. It's okay. And I must say that when I look at what is happening now in Poland, I am, first of all, very surprised in a bad way, because I thought that this would not happen. And the fact that the demons of the past could so easily be triggered, and that there is so much stuff coming out on a relatively spontaneous level. All that was needed was a permission. The fact that it's okay triggered an enormous wave of really ugly public reaction, and this is really very sad. For many years after the collapse of communism, one thing was common to all post-communist Polish governments. It was the realization that anti-Semitism is really destructive for Poland. Forget the Jews. It's bad for the Polish society. It's bad for the image of Poland abroad. It's there is only one international factor which is gaining from Poland being weaker, and this is not Poland and not Israel, but Russia. And this is a part of what's happening now in Europe, that various European countries, by various means, weakening the European Union, and Russia is very worried by the prospect of a strong European Union. And so this latest wave of the severe deterioration of Poland's international position is exactly what makes Russia happy, I think. And this is very sad. And I cannot avoid the thought, when I think about what's happening now, what would have happened? You know, this is, the expression is the road not taken. So Stanisław will talk later about people who decided not to leave Poland, and indeed, nothing terrible happened to them. Contrary to my parents' expectations, people did go to university, did get a good education. Many of them became active in various fields of life. But the scary part is what's happening now. If it's so easy to raise the demons, what's really underneath? This is a question I think we should, not we, but the people in Poland should ask themselves, what's really going on? Why is it so easy to trigger these demons? And it's very worrisome. So perhaps I should stop at this point, and if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them.